Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. A warm welcome to this evening's Colors of Glory virtual meet. I am Dhanesh Sankhyan, one of the coordinators of this event. So let me introduce what Colors of Glory Foundation is. Colors of Glory Foundation is an organization with the unique mission of bringing India's armed forces closer to the hearts and minds of ordinary Indians, probably the first of its kind in the country. We are proud that we have been highlighting India's rich military heritage by hosting numerous outdoor and indoor events during the past 4 years since we came into existence. Although we have been constrained to restrict our activities to these virtual events for almost a year now due to the pandemic threat, we have made it worthwhile for the participants by hosting interesting talks and presentation by eminent speakers on a variety of topics. And please be rest assured that we will bounce back with all action as soon as the situation improves. We eventually plan to extend our activities to other cities in India as well. Indeed, we will continue with the virtual meets as well as to reach out our audience all over India and overseas. We invite all of you who are not yet members of our organization to come to our fold. The modalities of obtaining a membership are available on our website. The URL, which appears at the bottom of our e-invites. Be a member and be a part of a unique initiative. In case you have an inclination to write, irrespective of whether you are a member or not, we invite you to contribute blogs for our website, which is already rich with more than 100 popular blogs on India's proud military past. Please feel free to call or email us for any clarifications. Now, before we commence today's event, please permit me to present a kaleidoscopic view of what we do. And now I request Dr. Ramakrishna Ramani to introduce our speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Danish. Thank you very much. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's my honor and privilege to introduce our distinguished speaker, Shri Bharat Venkat Epur, a gold medalist from the Hyderabad Public School and a graduate of IIT Madras. Mr. Epur obtained his master's degree in science from the United States before turning a businessman in India. He has always been a multifaceted personality who maintained an avid interest in multitude of activities, ranging from being an ardent quizzer and a quiz master par excellence to being an amateur historian and an art collector. A keen world traveler and a nature lover who has visited more than 50 countries, he is an internationally well-respected and highly ranking Freemason. His other areas of interest include owning racehorses and collecting vintage cars. He is no more active as a businessman, though he continues to be a director with a corporate organization. Mr. Epur, incidentally, is also a life member of the Colors of Glory Foundation. Team Colors of Glory is especially indebted to him for guiding us when we ventured to organize the All India Intercollegiate Military History Quiz in 2019. With no relevant experience in conducting such an event, we could not have made it a grand success that it turned out to be, without the benefit of the crucial guidance from someone so accomplished in the area. A big thank you, sir, from all of us, and especially me, since I had the privilege of being the quiz master during that particular episode of our quiz. The topic of today's talk, the role played by the Emir of Afghanistan in Allied victory in the First World War, is one which has been well researched by Mr. Epur. Being a Freemason himself, he has intimate knowledge of the role played by the Freemasons in making the Emir act the way that he did. So, sir, without much ado, I now invite you to deliver the talk. It's all over to you, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Ram, for that wonderful introduction. And may I request you to please allow Mr. Rinesh Hegde to share his screen.
You already did a medium.
Oh, right.
So, sorry, sir.
Good evening.
Sorry, sir. I still need the permission. I have not made the co-host yet.
Yeah, you can make him co-host.
Thank you.
While that is being sorted out, let me first thank particularly Captain D.K. Ramachandran for not only having invited me to become a member of this wonderful organization, the Colors of Glory Foundation, and also for inviting me to present this paper of mine. And I must place on record my very sincere thanks, as usual, to two members who are present today, Rinesh Hegde and Pradeep Kamath, who polished my paper into a presentation, which they will be presenting as I deliver this talk. Fellow members of the Colors of Glory Foundation, members of the Indian Armed Forces, active as well as retired, ladies and gentlemen, I must first preface this paper by saying that this is an acutely personal recollection and putting together bits and pieces of history which I picked up in from various sources and tried to make the entire puzzle from those bits and pieces come out with some kind of meaning, some kind of shape. I would like to mention here, first of all, that the Emir of Afghanistan did not, do anything, really radical in terms of helping the Allied victory. What he did was he did not do anything. So that I will explain that as I come into the paper. Now, the Emir of Afghanistan, to give his title, he was the eldest son of his father, Emir Abdul Rahman, and Asal Begum. She was earlier known as Gulraz Bibi. She was a former slave girl from a place called Wakhan. This is where modern-day Samarkand is in Uzbekistan. He was born on the 3rd of June, 1872. And he succeeded his father, Abdul Rahman, by right of primogeniture in October of 1901, the beginning of the 20th century. He had a younger brother called Nasrullah, who briefly succeeded him after his untimely demise. And then, of course, that succession was very short, because after that, the Emir of Afghanistan, Habibullah Khan's own son, took over. Now, before we proceed any further, I must take you on a quick historical tour of the area, keeping in mind the time period. I'm talking about the time period from the late 1800s to the early 1900s. With Britain and Russia, both ambitious and rapacious imperial powers, anxious to extend their hegemony over the whole world, both keen to corner the geographies, the markets, and the wealth from any and all. And in this part of Asia, with Afghanistan occupying its central location, it was not unexpected that these two powers would engage in what came to be known as the Great Game, which was a political and diplomatic confrontation that existed for most of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, between the British Empire and the Russian Empire. And in fact, it's still going on as we speak today. Afghanistan and its neighboring territories in Central and South Asia have been the fields of battle. This has also had direct consequences on the neighborhood, including British India as well as Persia. Now, what you see up there is a map of that period. I would like to just spend a little bit of time on the Anglo-Afghan Wars. The confrontation between the British colonial power and the locals in this area resulted in many, many wars. The most important of which were the so-called Anglo-Afghan Wars, of which there were three. The first Anglo-Afghan War was known by the British as the disaster in Afghanistan. And this was fought between the British Empire and the Emirate of Afghanistan between the years 1839 to 1842. Initially, the British successfully intervened in the succession dispute between Emir Dost Muhammad, he belonged to what is known as the Barakzai dynasty, and the former Emir Shah Shuja, who belonged to the Durrani dynasty, whom they installed upon conquering Kabul. In other words, the British installed Shah Shuja in place of Dost Muhammad. The main British Indian force occupying Kabul, along with its camp followers, having endured harsh winters as well as were completely annihilated by the Afghans when they were retreating in 1842 from Kabul. The British then sent what they called an army of retribution to Kabul to avenge the destruction of their previous forces. They defeated the Afghans and demolished large parts of the capital. After recovering their prisoners, they withdrew from Afghanistan by the end of the year. And Dost Muhammad returned from exile in India to resume his role. This was the first major conflicts during what came to be known as the Great Game. You see in the picture below you, it's a beautiful representation of the attacks of Ghazni Fort during the First Afghan War. Now, let's move on to the Second Anglo-Afghan War, which was again a military conflict fought between the British Raj and the Emirate of Afghanistan. This was from 1878 to 1880, when the latter was ruled by Sher Ali Khan of the Barakzai dynasty, who was the son of the former Emir Dost Muhammad. Now, this particular Afghan war was actually split into two parts, two campaigns. The first began in November 1878 with the British invasion of Afghanistan. The British were quickly victorious and forced the Emir Sher Ali to flee. Ali's successor was Muhammad Yaqub Khan, who was immediately sued for peace, and then the Treaty of Gandamak was signed on 26th of May 1879. The British then sent an envoy and a mission led by a person called Sir Louis Cavagnari to Kabul. But on the 3rd of September, this mission was totally massacred. And the conflict was reignited by Ayub Khan, which led to the abdication of Yaqub, who was Dost Muhammad's son. Sher Ali's son. Now, the second part of this war, which is the second campaign, ended in September 1880 when the British decisively defeated Ayub Khan outside Kandahar. A new emir, Abdur Rahman Khan, was selected, not elected, selected by the British, ratified and confirmed this Treaty of Gandamak once more. When the British and Indian soldiers had withdrawn, the Afghans agreed to let the British attain all their geopolitical objectives, as well as create a buffer between the British Raj and the Russian Empire. It was during this man, Abdur Rahman's rule, that the famous Durand Line Agreement was negotiated and agreed upon between British India and Afghanistan that clearly demarcated the boundary between the two. You see a photograph, an image of Mortimer Durand there, and also a representation of the famous Durand Line, which was actually the negotiated border, artificial border, I must say, between British India and Afghanistan. Incidentally, if you look at the same map of today, you will notice that the Durand line is as it is on the map, but the underlying countries have changed because the last part of the Durand line actually passes through Baluchistan, which is now was annexed by Pakistan at the time of independence of the country, at the creation of the country. Now, in 1893, I would like to just elaborate a little bit about Durand. In 1893, Mortimer Durand was deputed to Kabul by the government of British India for the purpose of setting an exchange of territory required for the demarcation of the boundary between northeastern Afghanistan and the Russian possessions, and in order to discuss with Emir Abdul Rahman Khan other pending questions. Abdul Rahman Khan showed his usual ability in diplomatic argument, his tenacity where his views or claims were in debate, with a sure underlying insight into the real situation. In the agreement that followed, relations between British Indian and Afghan governments, as previously arranged, were confirmed, and an understanding was reached upon the important and difficult subject of the borderline of Afghanistan on the east toward India. A royal commission was set up to determine the actual boundary between Afghanistan and British governed India, was tasked to negotiate the terms for agreeing to the Durand line between the two parties which are encamped at Parashina, which is now part of FATA, F-A-T-A, which is part of Pakistan now. This is now also close to a place called Khost in Afghanistan. From the British side, the political agency was the Khyber Agency, and from the British side, the camp was attended by Mortimer Durand, and from the Afghan side was Sahibzada Abdul Qayyum, who was the political agent of the Khyber Agency. Now, Afghanistan was represented by the Sahibzada Abdul Latif and Governor Sardar Sirindil Khan. And in 1893, Mortimer Durand negotiated with Abdul Rahman Khan the Durand Line Treaty for the demarcation of the frontier between Afghanistan, FATA, Northwest Frontier Province, and the Baluchistan Province, all now in Pakistan, which was the successor state, as you know, for that part of British India. In 1905, Amir Habibullah Khan, the Emir we are talking about, signed a new agreement with the United Kingdom, which confirmed the legality of the Durand Line. Similarly, the legality of the Durand Line was once again confirmed by King Amanullah Khan through the Treaty of Rawalpindi in 1919. This was at the end of the war. Now, let me move on to the third Afghan. The third Anglo-Afghan War was known also as the Third Afghan War. It was also known as the British-Afghan War of 1919. And in Afghanistan, it was known by another name. It was called the War of Independence. It began on the 6th of May 1919 when the Emirate of Afghanistan invaded British India and ended with an armistice on the 8th of August 1919. The war resulted in Afghans winning back control of foreign affairs from Britain and the British recognizing Afghanistan as an independent nation. According to the British author Michel Barthorpe, it was also a strategic victory for the British because the Durand Line was reaffirmed as the border between Afghanistan and the British. And the Afghans agreed not to foment trouble on the British side. Please note this. They agreed not to foment trouble on the British side. However, the Afghans who were already on the British side of the border did cause concerns because they were revolting against the British within British India. Now, I would like to push the story along to the ascent to power and the rule of the Emir Habibullah Khan, which is the central topic we are talking today. There are some pictures coming up about him. He is fairly swarthy man, and he liked his Western clothing, and he liked his jewelry. You can see him with his father in the middle, bottom middle, and the family, and others are all about him in various dresses, various poses. Habibullah Khan was Abdul Rahman's eldest son, kept a close watch on the palace intrigues that were surrounding him. Although he secured his position as ruler in October 1901 with support from the army, Habibullah Khan was not as domineering as his father Abdul Rahman. Consequently, the influence of religious leaders as well as that of Mahmud Tarzi, who was a cousin of the king, increased during his reign. Tarzi was a highly educated, well-traveled poet and journalist, founded an Afghan nationalist newspaper called Siraj al-Akbar with Habibullah Khan's agreement, and until 1919 used the newspaper as a platform for rebutting clerical criticism of Western influence changes in government and the society. And the paper was also known for espousing full Afghan independence and for other reforms. Tarzi's passionate nationalism for Afghanistan influenced an entire generation of future reformers and later than that. Now, Habibullah Khan, on ascending the Afghan throne, in his coronation speech announced his interest in pursuing policies of national unity, resistance from foreign aggression.
Yeah.
If you could mute some of those people, please. A lot of disturbance. Thank you. Now, his goal was, as I said, to achieve absolute Afghan central government. Many people who had been forced into exile by his father were allowed to return to Afghanistan because he granted a general amnesty and allowed these people to return back to Afghanistan. Most of them had been exiled in India. Among this was a group who would end the rule of his own family. And there was a group of Yahya Khail family. They were usually known as the Musaiban, or they were the courtiers. And they were the descendants of Sultan Muhammad Khan, the brother of the Emir Dost Muhammad Khan, whom I mentioned earlier. So in this, he made a strategic blunder by allowing this family people to return to his own native country. Because among these were the descent of 5 brothers, Muhammad Aziz Khan, Muhammad Nadir Khan, Muhammad Hashim Khan, Shah Wali Khan, and Shah Mahmud Khan. They and their progeny were responsible for finishing the rule and life of Emir of Afghanistan, and their progeny ruled Afghanistan for most of the 20th century. In the year 1907, Habibullah Khan traveled to India. There he was much taken with the technology of the steam train as well as the motor car. He also availed of himself this opportunity to become a Freemason, and that was at the hands of General Lord Kitchener, who was then the commander-in-chief of the British Army in India. I shall elaborate on this a little bit later in the paper. Habibullah Khan, as I told you, was a relatively reform-minded ruler who attempted to modernize his country. During his reign, he worked to bring modern medicine and other technologies to Afghanistan. He also worked to place progressive reforms in society. He instituted various legal reforms and repealed many of the harshest criminal penalties. Other reforms include the dismantling of a repressive internal intelligence organization that had been put in place by his father. And in 1904, he founded the Habibia School for Boys, where the students were taught maths, geography, calisthenics, as well as English and Urdu. He also established a military college where officers could be trained. Between 1901 and 1904, Habibullah Khan bought equipment for the local industry. He also continued to improve communication and trade. He built new roads and demonstrated that travel was indeed important. The boundary with Iran was also firmly delineated in the same year, 1904, replacing the hitherto ambiguous line made by a British commission way back in 1872. Agreement, however, could not be reached on the sharing of the waters of the Helmand River. Now, Habibullah wanted full Afghan independence and Great Britain's assistance in an attempt to regain lands which had been occupied by the Russians. Ladies and gentlemen, remember, Russians were there in that time also, not only in the 1970s. Now, Britain, however, was not so interested in the point of view of Afghanistan. They were far more interested in the European power struggle and the defense of India through the Afghan buffer state, and that was not of any interest to them. So, like all foreign policy developments of this period affecting Afghanistan, the conclusion of the great game between Russia and Britain occurred without the Afghan rulers' participation. They entered into an agreement. It is known as the 1907 Anglo-Russian Convention, or Entente, ENT, Entente. This not only divided the region into separate areas of Russian and British influence, but also established the foundations of Afghan neutrality. There's a beautiful cartoon coming up on screen. It is Afghanistan kind of saddled in the middle with the British lion on one side and the Russian bear on the other side. And it says, "Save me from my friends." Now, the convention, as I mentioned, which I mentioned, 1907 convention, provided for Russian acquiescence that Afghanistan was now outside the sphere of influence, and Russia had to consult directly with Britain on all matters relating to Russian-Afghan relations. How cheeky of them. Britain, for its own part, would not occupy or annex Afghan territory or interfere whatsoever in Afghans' internal affairs. This was the basic crux of that agreement. Now, during the First World War, Afghanistan remained neutral despite pressure to support Turkey. If you remember, the Ottoman Turks were part of the other side. They were together with the Germans were on one side, whereas UK and its allies were on the other side. Now, the Turkish Sultan was pressurizing Afghanistan to support him. And this was his catchword there was jihad, or the holy war. Now, Habibullah Khan did, however, enter into what came to be known as a Turco-German mission and an agreement, sort of, so to speak, when this Turco-German mission came into Kabul in the year 1915. After much procrastination, he won an agreement from the Central Powers being the other side, Germans and the Turkish and others, for a huge payment and arms provision in exchange for actually attacking British India. So he agreed to attack British India in exchange for whatever he got, money, etc. But this man was a crafty ruler who clearly viewed the war as an opportunity to play one side off against the other. For he also offered the British to resist the Central Powers from an attack on India in exchange for an end to the British control over Afghan foreign policy. So you see how he was playing one against the other, basically for the betterment of his own country and for his own interests. Nothing wrong with that. The Emir of Afghanistan was a Saturnine and quick-tempered gentleman, considerably below average height, bull-necked, broad-shouldered, inclined to stoutness, customarily wearing a long frock coat and a high cap of black lambskin. You see that coming up on screen. And as Afghan rulers went, he was rather enlightened and a progressive monarch. The people over whom he ruled there were, on the contrary, probably the fiercest, cruelest, and most reactionary folk on earth. It was only to be expected, therefore, that they would view the progressive and pro-British tendencies of the Emir with suspicion. The title given to him was the Lamp of Faith and Nation. Now, this was a title which he gave himself quite immodestly, I must say. And he was very keen that all his clothes should be tailored by an English tailor, no less. And he wanted to have European table manners in the court life at Kabul. And he had this penchant for roaring up and down narrow country mountain roads in his great red motor car, which stampeded the camel caravans and was in the views of the haughty and pious followers of the Prophet, and they considered this incompatible with his position and with the teachings of the Quran. The resentment of the subjects was still further heightened when he accepted an invitation to visit the Viceroy of India at Government House in Calcutta. Because if you remember that time, Calcutta was the capital of India. It had not yet shifted to New Delhi. Habibullah returned from that visit. His baggage was filled with Western novelties, and his head was filled with Western ideas. In May 1912, Habibullah Khan faced the only crisis in his career when a rebellion erupted in Khost. It was led by Jehandad Khan, who was a rival claimant to the Afghan throne. And this rebellion was known as the Khost Rebellion. And this rebellion ended in August that same year when the rebels were given concessions for the Afghan government. And in February 1919, Habibullah Khan was taking a much needed vacation from his duties as Afghanistan's Emir by going out on a hunting expedition in Jalalabad. And over the preceding months, he had managed to anger two powerful groups on opposite ends of the spectrum by stubbornly sticking to a position of neutrality through the end of the First World War. And not only had the war seemed to nationalists to be a chance for Afghanistan to finally break free of British colonial rule, but conservative religious leaders were appalled that Habibullah Khan had not sided with the Ottoman Empire, the largest remaining Muslim kingdom. With the defeat of Turkey by a Christian power and the occupation of the holy places of Islam, fanaticism was aroused, together with the bitter feeling that Afghanistan had failed Islam in its hour of need. This is what was written by a British diplomat, Sir Percy Sykes, and this particular quotation is from Thomas Barfield's book, Afghanistan, A Cultural and Political History. I'll speak about this a little bit more. The more secular nationalists were all the more livid because at the very least they had expected Amir Amanullah Khan to have made a deal with the British in which Afghanistan would receive its independence peacefully in return for not entering the war on the side of England's foes. But the British, as always, prevaricated on the issue at the war's end. And Barfield writes, leaving Habibullah in a very precarious position. Now, Habibullah Khan, facing criticism from both sides, could at least rest peacefully knowing that because of the repressive policies of Habibullah's late father, Abdur Rahman, he was most likely safe from a popular revolt. But it did not secure him from enemies closer to home, including his closest relatives. On the morning of 20th of February 1919, Habibullah was found murdered in his tent, the victim of an unknown assassination. Habibullah's murderers were believed to have been from the Mujahideen family, which I referred to earlier, one of whom was the commander responsible for the soldiers protecting Habibullah himself. So the enemy was within. Just who killed him or arranged to have him killed remains a subject of speculation to this day, says Barfield's book, which was published not too long ago, in the year 2010. Upon Habibullah's death, his brother Nasrullah, as I mentioned, proclaimed himself Emir and immediately secured the fealty of Habibullah's two eldest sons. But Habibullah's third son, Amanullah, condemned his uncle as a traitor and his father's assassin. And Barfield writes that Amanullah was already a rather popular political figure in Kabul, and he quickly pulled the military to his side. Outflanked, Nasrallah abdicated the throne and handed the leadership of Afghanistan to Amanullah. Amanullah's own son, Habibullah, went on to reverse this humiliating treaty entered into by Yaqub Khan, which made Afghanistan, for all intents and purposes, a British protectorate. Amanullah sought to fight for independence and the freedom of the Peshawar Valley, and so moved his forces across the Durand Line in May 1919. This was the start of the Third Anglo-Afghan War, which I mentioned earlier. Not everything went in favor of the Afghans. The Afghan fort at Spin Boldak was attacked. Quote, there was a small water pool in the courtyard of Baldak fort. The British planes dropped bombs in the water reservoir in order to stop the water supply to Afghan soldiers. An old lady whose two sons were among the soldiers supplied drinking water for the soldiers. When she brought the second goat skin used as a water container, her one son had been killed. She, however, did not stop supplying water until her second son and she herself died. This is from the same book as what we're quoting from. Now, Britain bombed several Afghan cities, and one of the pilots involved would become notorious as the future leader of the Bomber Command in the Second World War. His name was Arthur Bomber Harris. Habibullah's peaceful response was one day shattered when his bomb, Habibullah by that time had been entombed. So even that peaceful repose in his own tomb was shattered when one of the bombs from Bomber Harris landed right on top of the tomb. Fortunately, this war was short-lived, and Afghanistan was granted the right of a fully independent nation, able to run its own foreign policy in exchange for recognizing the existing borders with the new Treaty of Rawalpindi. However, had the war lasted longer, Britain was ready to use chemical weapons, and this has been obtained by looking into the records. So they were absolutely happy resorting to chemical weapons. I would like to now switch the focus back to World War I. Now, World War I broke out, as we all know, on 28th of July, 1914, when the Austro-Hungarians declared war on Serbia after a group of young pro-independent Serbian terrorists led by Gavrilo Princip shot dead the Austro-Hungarian Crown Prince, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, in Sarajevo 1 month earlier. This was called the Urkastrophe of the 20th century, original catastrophe, by the US historian George F. Kennan, and later it was known as the First Global War. It was fought on 4 continents. It included battles in Europe, Northern and Sub-Saharan Africa, the Middle East, the Caucasus, Southeast and East Asia, as well as the South Pacific. The main underlying motive was the rivalry between the colonial powers Great Britain, France, and Russia, the so-called Entente, and the economic latecomers, Germany, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, as well as Ottoman Turkey. These were the so-called Mittelmachte, which means Central Powers. They were vying to expand in Europe and for new markets overseas. In the 4 years of this war, 9.3 million soldiers were killed, 21.4 million were wounded, 7.6 million were taken prisoners or went missing. The 71.6 million were mobilized from all participating countries. And these were on the battlefields and on the oceans. This was the first case of so-called industrial warfare, with soldiers using machine guns, poison gas, and submarines. In addition, 7.9 million civilians were killed, but military casualties still outnumber, a situation that however changed the Second World War. According to various Indian sources, 60 to 65,000 of the 1.1 million soldiers from the subcontinent who served overseas were dead by the end of the war. But only the names of 54,896 are recorded. The Commonwealth War Graves Commission put the number of Indian soldiers sent to the Western Front in Europe at 140,000 over the course of the war, 90,000 serving in the infantry and cavalry, and 50,000 non-combatants in the so-called Indian Labour Corps. Of the combatants, about 8,550 were killed and as many as 50,000 more were wounded. This Indian Labour Corps was the one that actually did all the heavy work, laying railway lines, doing all sorts of things. In Afghanistan's neighborhood, Iran, then it was known as Persia, was officially neutral, but partly occupied by British, which are mainly Indian, and partly occupied by Russian troops. Both these countries had split Iran into two spheres of influence with the 1907 Anglo-Russian Treaty of St. Petersburg. In South Iran, there are installations of the Anglo-Persian Oil Company. Now remember, my dear listeners, oil was the new, currency there. Oil had been discovered. Many people have established their oil empires. German agents who were trying to persuade the Iranian ruler, who was a very young 18-year-old Ahmad Shah at that time, they were trying to persuade him to join the Central Powers against the current occupying powers, which was Russia and Britain. They were trying to instigate uprisings of local tribes to wage a guerrilla war against the Entente troops. And they also supported activists of the Persian Democratic Constitution opposition to join. The Germans were supported by the Persian gendarmerie that was led by Swedish officers who sympathized with them. Now remember Sweden, Sweden also had a role here. But when Turkish troops allied with the Central Powers and occupied parts of northwestern Iran early in the war, the German-Persian relationship suffered. In the Central Asian part of Russia, the Kazakhs and other peoples rose up against the mobilization for the war. Until then, they had been totally exempted from military service. The area also became a venue for prisoner of war camps for millions of Austrians, including the Czech and the Hungarians, as well as German prisoners of war. Afghanistan, however, was not a party in this war, but was indirectly dragged into the conflict. Its ruler, Emir of Khan, dependent on British subsidies, maintained its neutrality, despite German and Ottoman Turkey's attempts to win him over as an ally and sympathies in his court for the Central Powers. And there was already a generally anti-British mood prevailing in the country. Turkey, which was in practice then ruled by what came to be known as the Young Turks, were a group of constitutionalist military officers and civil servants who had taken power in a coup in 1913. They tried to woo the emir by invoking the religious appeal of the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed V Rashad, who, as the caliph, was also the head of the worldwide Muslim Ummah. On the 11th of November 1914, he declared jihad or holy war on the Entente powers. In a fatwa to the Muslim soldiers in the ranks of the opposing armies, he urged them to desert their colonial masters and to switch to the Islamic side. The young Turk Minister of War was a person called Enver Pasha, who sought Afghan backing for Turkish territorial ambitions in Persia, in the Caucasus, and in Russian Central Asia, which had a large Turkic population. And he had already told the Germans in a secret message on the 2nd of August 1914 that his country, Turkey, was ready to join the war on Germany's side. Turkey's first military engagement with the Entente, however, only came on the 29th of October 1914, when two of its ships, which are actually German vessels, delivered to the Ottoman army and still with German crew. These two ships shelled the Russian ports of Odessa and Sevastopol. As a result, Russia declared war on Turkey on the 2nd of November 1914. This is soon followed by France and Great Britain. Germany's main target was British India. As the German Indologist Jochen Osterfeld wrote, quote, German policy was aware of India's importance as the main pillar of British worldwide power. And individual German representations were of the opinion that only by the liberation of India, Germany and its Turkish ally would come in the position to freely unfurl economically beyond Baghdad, Basra, and Kuwait, and that a liberated India would be an economic factor of enormous importance for Germany and its allies. While the war did not directly aim to occupy India, although there were some individuals who might have dreamt of it, Germany and its allies attempted to entice parts of the Indian population, particularly the Pathans in the northwest, beyond the Afghan frontier, to rise up against the British in order to pin them down as many British forces as possible so as to keep them away from the European battlefields. Britain left only 3 divisions in India to protect the Afghan border. The German Kaiser, in an internal communication on the 30th of July 1914, 2 days before the outbreak of war, stated, quote, if we shall perish shedding our blood, England must at least lose India, unquote. The German attempt to win Afghanistan to its side and all its activity in the Orient was based on the memorandum that the famous German diplomat and traveler and archaeologist, a person called Baron Max von Oppenheim, coming up on screen, submitted to the Kaiser in the year 1914 with the self-explanatory title. In German it goes like this: Denkschrift betreffend die Revolutionierung der islamischen Gebiet unserer Feinde. Its English translation is Memorandum with regard to revolutionizing the Islamic realms of our enemies. Oppenheim pinned particular hope on Afghanistan, hoping that the country would participate in invading British India in an alliance with Turkey and Persia, not least to win back the Pashtun populated areas in the northwest of India. He wrote, quote, Afghanistan is a firmly established statehood, and despite its small population, a power that should not be underestimated. The population is belligerent and proud. A large general Indian uprising will only occur when Afghan troops will victoriously enter the Indus Valley, naturally only after India itself has been prepared for revolution, unquote. In this context, Oppenheim picked up a plan proposed by the Turkish Minister of War, same Enver Pasha I mentioned earlier, immediately after the start of the war to send a Turkish military mission joined by some Germans to Afghanistan. In 1914, Emir Habibullah, having been initiated into Freemasonry by that time, which I will talk about towards the end of my paper, remained neutral. Remember here, he remained neutral, despite the fact that the Ottoman Caliph was a German ally. Through the Niedermeyer-Hentig expedition, as it was known as, it was also given an alternate name, the Kabul Mission. It was sent by the Central Powers and to Kabul, and Indian revolutionaries like Ubaidullah Sindhi and Raja Pratap had also come to Kabul to prevail upon the Emir to liberate India. Emir Habibullah Khan could not betray his brother Freemasons. The Turkish mission to Kabul on behalf of the Ottoman Caliph then presented him with a chadar and a sword to the Emir. While the sword represented armed struggle, the chadar given to the Emir to wear was for being covered. You can see this, this beautiful photograph of the Ottoman Empire declaring jihad. And the chadar which they presented is also on top. It is basically humiliated. Now, Emir Habibullah Khan had failed to fulfill his Islamic obligation and wage jihad against British India. Whilst though many Afghans and the Turks were displeased with Habibullah, the British obviously were delighted. They said, quote, "The faithful friendship of His Majesty Habibullah Khan, Emir of Afghanistan, was thus by no means an unimportant factor in the successful issue of the war, and it is pleasant to think that Freemasonry played its part in creating and cementing the friendship that led to that result." Unquote. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I've given you the story of how Emir Habibullah Khan chose to remain neutral and therefore allowed British India to divert many of its assets to the Western Front. And India remained calm and there's not any disturbance for the British to continue their rule. Now, I would like to spend the last part of my paper on the actual Freemasonic story behind this. The British government in 1906 had invited the Emir of Afghanistan to visit India, and on his acceptance of the invitation, Sir Arthur Henry McMahon, who was the Chief Commissioner of Balochistan, was placed in charge of all matters connected with his stay in India. The Emir arrived at the India frontier at a place called Lundi Kotal on the 2nd of January 1907, accompanied by a numerous retinue, which included escorts of infantry and cavalry. I would like to spend a few minutes talking about this particular person, Sir Arthur Henry McMahon. Lieutenant Colonel Sir Vincent Arthur Henry McMahon was a British Indian Army officer and diplomat who served as the High Commissioner of Egypt from 1915 to 1970. He then was an administrator in the British Raj and served twice as Chief Commissioner of Balochistan. McMahon is best known for the Hussein-McMahon correspondence with Hussein bin Ali, the McMahon line between Tibet and India, and the Declaration to the Seven in response to the memorandum written by 7 notable Syrians. After the so-called Sykes-Picot Agreement was published by the Bolshevik Russian government in November 1917, McMahon resigned. He's also featured prominently in the famous book by T.E. Lawrence, 7 Pillars of Wisdom, which is an account of the Arab revolt against the Ottoman Empire during the same First World War. So he's a very interesting character, worthy of paper in himself. By that time, Al-Emir was 34 years of age, and he had never set foot outside his own country. He was, said Sir Henry, a man of very superior intellect and surprisingly well informed on most general subjects. A few days after his arrival, he astonished Sir Henry McMahon by expressing a wish to become a Freemason. But not knowing his motives, Sir Henry gave him no encouragement. The Emir returned to the subject on several occasions without success. It was not until the 22nd of January that Sir Henry realized how very much the Emir was in earnest. He begged that if it could be done, it should be without the knowledge of any of his own personal staff or the Afghan people. Now, why the Emir wanted to become a Mason or how he came to learn anything about Freemasonry, Sir Henry was never able to discover. All that the Emir ever admitted was that he had met a large number of good men who were in fact Masons. He knew Freemasonry to be a good thing and wanted to enter it, and knew something about operative Masonry was evident from the facility with which he recognized the various Freemasons' marks on the stones of the old Mughal emperors' tombs and places that they had visited, such as that of Emperor Akbar at Agra and of Emperor Humayun at Delhi and others. The problem was one of extreme difficulty. The only Masonic lodge in India which in any way met the requirement of the case was one in Calcutta. It was known as Lodge Concordia, number 3102. The picture up there is of the current Freemasons Hall in Calcutta, which was built in the early 1900s. This Lodge Concordia was a small but exclusive lodge. Membership was restricted to British civil and military officers of the highest possible standing. The Emir and his retinue were to arrive in Calcutta in 6 days' time, on the 28th of January that year, and they were to stay there for only 1 week. If the Emir were to be made a Freemason, it would only be in Calcutta, and whatever Masonic work had to be done must be done at one and the same meeting. Apart from the obligation of secrecy, which would be hard enough to ensure that even one visit to the lodge, the crowded schedule of traveling and official and social engagements made it impossible to fit in more than one Masonic meeting. In other words, if the Emir were to be made a Freemason in all 3 degrees, which is essential in Masonry, they must be given to him at the same meeting, on site, and all the protocols must be waived. Only 13 days were available to accomplish all this. Impossible as the matter seemed, Sir Henry was sufficiently impressed with the possible advantages of fulfilling the Emir's wish to make a very strenuous effort. At that time, General Lord Horatio Herbert Kitchener, at the age of 33, had been initiated in 1883 in another lodge which had almost the same name, La Concordia Lodge, number 12226 in Cairo, in Egypt. And in October 1902, Kitchener was appointed to India as Commander-in-Chief of the British Indian Army, and he also was appointed to the highest Masonic post in the northern India as the District Grand Master of the District Grand Lodge of Punjab. He began to practice what is now a familiar pattern of taking active interest in Masonic affairs. And in 1903, he joined the Himalayan Brotherhood Lodge number 459 in Shimla, which was, of course, as you know, the summer capital of the Raj. In the same year, he became a senior founder member of Kitchener Lodge, which is named for him, one of many such lodges to bear his name. So Sir Henry McMahon wrote to the Grand Master of Freemasonry, who was actually from England, and who was none other than Prince Arthur, who was the Duke of Connaught and Strathern, and he was actually one of the very related to the Queen at that time. So this person was coincidentally on a visit to Ceylon. And Sir Henry McMahon wrote to him, communicating the facts of the case, and begged him to telegraph something like an all-embracing dispensation to meet the many requirements of the occasion. This he did forthwith, and at once came the reply from the Duke: I approve of the Emir receiving 3 degrees and give dispensation. Welcome into the craft in the name of Connaught. And this is a copy of that dispensation, handwritten dispensation, which was sent, and it is preserved now. So in the year 1907, he attended a meeting, the namesake of his mother lodge Concordia in Calcutta, and Kitchener, I'm talking about Kitchener now, agreed to assist at the initiation, passing, and raising on the same day of His Majesty Emir Habibullah Khan. With these difficulties removed, the rest of Sir Henry's task proved much easier. Getting into communication with the Worship Master of Lodge Concordia, a person called Worship Brother Dentith, he found him willing and eager to give all necessary assistance. It now remained only to take every possible step to ensure absolute secrecy. The building you see coming up is the office of the District Grand Master in Freemasons Hall in Calcutta. Worship Brother Dentith called for an emergency meeting of the lodge on the 2nd of February at 9:30 p.m., 9:30 in the night. And this notice was served by a summons which was handwritten, which was delivered by hand to the members. And here's a copy of that handwritten summons. It was delivered in secret to the members of the lodge so that no information about this proposed meeting would leak. To understand the vital importance of secrecy, it was necessary to remember that this was the very first occasion on which the ruler of Afghanistan had ever ventured to leave his country. And he had done so against the wishes and advice of his bigoted advisors, who had prophesied that nothing but evil would come of his association with foreign infidels, and that his absence would give dangerous opportunities to ill-wishers to foment conspiracy and trouble. It was therefore a matter of vital importance to prevent any knowledge of this present action from coming to the ears of his followers and then to the Afghan public. It would give his enemies at home a handle with which great harm could be done. Among the numerous public engagements the Emir was accordingly arranged a dinner on 2nd of February with the Commander-in-Chief of India, Lord Kitchener. In the ordinary course, when dining out, the Emir was always accompanied by various members of his Afghan staff. But on this occasion, the Emir at the very last moment expressed a wish to go unaccompanied by any staff member as a special compliment to his friend Lord Kitchener. Thus, he and Sir Henry went alone. Immediately after dinner, at which only Lord Kitchener and his personal staff were present, the party drove unobserved to Freemasons Hall Park Street. There, the members of Lodge Concordia were waiting to receive them, and the proceedings of the evening began forthwith. I would like to now give you the list of officers who were present. The Worshipful Master, as I mentioned to you, was Worshipful Dented, who was an ICS officer. The senior warden was Worshipful Sir Andrew H.L. Fraser, who was the then Lieutenant Governor of Bengal. The junior warden was Worshipful Sir Charles Allen, who was the chairman of the Calcutta Corporation. The secretary was the Venerable W.A.G. Luckman, who was the Archdeacon of Calcutta. The treasurer was Worshipful J.C. Branson, ICS, who was the Accountant General of Bengal. The chaplain was Worshipful Brother the Reverend Canon T.E. Cole, and the senior deacon was Brother General Sir Ronald MacDonald, who was GOC Presidency Brigade. The junior deacon was Brother W.D.R. Prentice, an ICS officer. The inner guard was Major McKay, who was an Indian Medical Service officer. The Tyler was Captain P.G.H. Hogg, R.E. R.E. here refers to the Royal Engineers, known as the Sappers. That's quite an impressive lineup, wouldn't you agree? Initially, many years later, this is a personal note of mine, I had the privilege and pleasure many decades later, in the year 2008, to be precise, of serving as the Centenary Master of the Sir Andrew Fraser Lodge, named for this Andrew Fraser mentioned here. And this was Lodge number 72. And this was a seminal event in the centenary of that lodge. I sat as a master of that lodge in the centenary year. This is a private note. Now, coming back to the main story. On that evening, remember the meeting started at 9:30. The Worshipful Master opened the lodge and then vacated the chair in favor of a person called Worshipful G. Lane Anderson, who was a Deputy District Grand Master. That is number 2 in the District of Bengal. And His Majesty Amanullah Khan, the Emir of Afghanistan, was then proposed as a candidate for initiation by Right Worshipful Brother His Excellency General Lord Kitchener, who was District Grand Master of Punjab. That is the number 1 in that district. And he was also at that time Commander-in-Chief India. And this proposition was duly seconded by Right Worshipful Brother Sir W. Burkitt, who was the District Grand Master of Bengal, the number 1 of the Bengal district. At that time, he was serving as Chief Justice of the United Provinces. Obviously, the ballot was unanimous. The first, second, and third degrees were then conferred on the candidates in full, not on site. And there were lots, they did most of the portion. An unusual feature of this meeting and the proceedings was the fact that the candidate expressed his unwillingness to take part in any portion of the ceremony until he clearly understood its nature. And as his knowledge of the English language was very imperfect, it was necessary to explain everything to him in his own language. It was Persian. Knowing the likelihood of this, Sir Henry McMahon had volunteered to carry out the duties of junior deacon to basically to assist him in the first and second degrees, and then as senior deacon in the second and third degrees, the latter part of the ceremony to keep himself at just next to the candidate so that he can explain to him every portion of the ritual in Persian. Obviously, you can imagine this took time for the meeting to end. And the picture coming up on screen is inside the Masonic temple in Calcutta. And you see all these plaques on the walls, marble plaques. They all commemorate famous occasions, including the Emir of Afghanistan. The task, however, did not end there because Lord Kitchener, at the conclusion of the meeting, decided to give a lengthy but impressive address on the value of Freemasonry, which also had to be translated into Persian. At the conclusion of the ceremonies, which were conducted, as I said, in a very impressive manner, the Worship Master resumed his chair and a few graceful words bade the Emir a warm welcome into Freemasonry and membership of the lodge. By the time all this was over, it was well past midnight, and then the Emir was personally introduced to the officers and members of the lodge. And these also included at that time Sir James Meston, who was the Financial Secretary to the Government of India, Colonel C.D. Philpott, who was Secretary to the Board of Examiners, and Sir Robert Howland, etc., etc., etc. There was a huge battalion of impressive, distinguished people there. And the Emir, to mark his gratitude to Lodge Concordia, presented the lodge with a very handsome silver cup and a copy of the Holy Quran, on which he had taken his obligation. This copy of the Holy Quran is now well preserved in the library of the United Grand Lodge of England in London. Sir Henry McMahon recorded that so successful proved the measures taken to ensure security that, notwithstanding the curiosity of the Emir's own following and the strong searchlight of the public and press, which played on every action or movement of the Emirs during his visit to India, no knowledge of his Masonic episode ever came to light until after his return to Afghanistan. Then, from some unknown source, rumors of the Emir having become a Freemason began to spread, and the fanatical mullahs of the country seized upon them for the purpose of stirring up trouble. On this coming to the Emir's knowledge, he summoned the leading mullahs to appear before him, and at a public darbar informed all present that he was not only a Freemason, but proud of it, that he had become one for the benefit of his country, and that if ever a mullah were found to criticize his actions in this matter, he would pay for it with his head. Sir Henry McMahon stressed that he could not conclude the historic account of the Emir's entry into Freemasonry without recording the important consequences of it. That the Emir was profoundly impressed by Freemasonry became very evident to Henry McMahon from the frequency with which, whenever they were alone together, the Emir kept harking back to the Masonic evening in Calcutta, to the various portions of the ceremony, and to what had been therein communicated to him. His feeling towards British became friendly and cordial, a feeling which grew deeper and stronger each day of his visit to India. Sir Henry McMahon regarded it as of far less importance than the sense of confidence and trust that gradually grew up in his mind, which he carried away with him to Afghanistan. Sir Henry was convinced that his experience of Freemasonry played no small part in creating that trust and preserving it unweakened through the years to come. Among his last words to Sir Henry on leaving India was the expression of a solemn vow to prove a faithful friend of England so long as England kept faith with him. How loyally he kept his word was proved through the Great War of 1914 to 1918, when time after time missions were sent to Kabul from Turkey and Germany, offering him alluring temptations of territory and power if he would only take their side in the war. Not only did he hold out loyally against all temptation, but thanks to his firm stand on his country and the border tribes, the northwest frontier of India enjoyed complete peace throughout the war. So much so that Britain was able to denude British India of British and Indian forces and to send them to other fields of war. Quote, the value of this to us was incalculable, as was soon proved when within a few weeks of the end of the Great War, our loyal friend and ally was struck down by the hands of a cowardly assassin. The firm hand that had kept peace on our frontier was removed. Afghanistan feuded against us, and British troops were sent rushing back in great strength to India. If this had been necessary during the war, the history of that war might have been changed. The faithful friendship of His Majesty Habibullah Khan, Emir of Afghanistan, was by no means an unimportant factor in the successful issue of the war. And it is pleasant to think that Freemasonry played its part in creating and cementing the friendship that led to that result. Now, there's there are lots of other little bits and pieces which we could go on and on, but I think I've taken enough of your time. I hope I've given you a fascinating insight into the story and the life and times of Habibullah Khan, the Emir of Afghanistan, and his initiation into Freemasonry, and how it evolved from then and impacted upon the turbulent history of his time. This, ladies and gentlemen, is part of a 4-lecture series which I've created. It talks about the beginning of the Great Game and how Afghanistan became known as the graveyard of empires. And it continues to this day. We all are well familiar with modern news and happenings. Afghanistan still holds center stage as the graveyard of empires and part of the Great Game. And these are my references coming up on screen. And I thank you once again for your patient listening.
Thank you very much, Bharat, for this such a fascinating talk. I mean, and the visuals are splendid. There's such a lot of archive collection you have, I find.
Thank you, sir.
I mean, ladies and gentlemen, I'm sure some of you may have some questions, and the speaker would be happy to answer. So you can unmute yourself and shoot your questions, please.
Sir, I also sent you a copy of this paper by email earlier this morning.
Yes, I've got it. I saw it early in the afternoon.
Yeah. If anybody's interested, they can access that from your hands.
I had only time to browse through it anyway. I've heard you now. No problem. Yeah. Questions, later question hour is open. I mean, when we say questions, you can always, your comments also welcome, but brief, so that everybody gets to know.
Sir, I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Does Indo-German plot or conspiracy have any connection with the emirs or not?
Which one are you talking about, brother?
The Hindu-German conspiracy in 1917, 20th February.
Hindu-German conspiracy, yeah.
Yes.
The thing is, please understand that there are so many conspiracies, so many plots, so many agreements, and they're all specific to a particular period in the war and a particular area. What I'm talking about is what we know as Afghanistan and Northwest Frontier Province and all that stuff. So the conflicting empires, there were the British on one side along with the Russians. On the other side were the Germans and the Turks. And of course, Persia sort of being sucked into it. So that was the thing. And what is curious was some of the Scandinavian countries were on the side of the Germans. So that is something which I never knew till I did a little bit of research into this particular subject. So as far as the question which you have raised, I'm not sure if it is relevant to this portion of the war. I mean, I'll have to do further study on that.
Thank you, sir.
I have a question, or rather, from what I've understood, this Duran line, it was British and Afghans, both sides sort of found, um, you know, suiting their objectives. Isn't that what it came to? Because Amanullah was came came up on the promise of removing the British influence, and British found this ultimately they can make him recognize this Duran line. Am I right?
Correct, sir. The Duran line was basically a commission was led by Duran and a few others. So they sat and discussed about this, and they drew this artificial line on the map, and they agreed that on this side of the line would be British India, and the other side would be Afghanistan. Because if you remember, that time there was only British India and Afghanistan, and beyond that were the Central Asian states. So Pakistan was constructed to happen much later. So, and, but the area of Baluchistan was an established entity at that time, just like Afghanistan was. It was ruled by the Khalats and all the other people were there. And earlier in the 19th century, the emirs of Sindh used to rule what is now Karachi and that area. So there were these different groups of people who had this control over different areas. And most of West Pakistan, which is not in Sindh, was ruled by the empire of Maharaja Ranjit Singh. So it was under his, and then the great Maharaja. So when he died, there was a succession battle, and then it fell into the hands of that young boy, Dilip Singh, who was then kind of taken away to England and made a got into the custody of the Queen herself, Queen Victoria. So it was and Ranjit Singh played his game masterfully. Whenever it suited him, he would side with the British against the Afghans. And when it suited him, he would side with the British with the Afghans against the British. And he was powerful enough, rich enough to be able to handle that kind of diplomatic, how should I say, tightrope walking. So he was quite famous for that. And in fact, at one point in time, he was so successful in that he was able to convince the Afghan chap to give away the Kohinoor diamond, which had come into their possession when it was stolen from Delhi. That when it was, when the invaders came and they took away the Kohinoor diamond. So it ended up with the Maharaja Ranjit Singh. And then, of course, you know how there's a wonderful story about how the British took away that stone. So it's a fascinating story. The whole it's a broad canvas spreading over from the 1700s going into 1800s, 1900s, and all that. So and there are central characters in this entire tale, and they were larger than life characters on all sides. Whether it was the British, there were some Indians who were larger than life characters. So it's a beautiful story waiting to be told.
Any more questions, please? Yeah, please unmute yourself. Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah. Now you can.
You can hear me?
Yeah. Speak on.
The aspect of Freemasons, I would like to have a little bit more information on that, because none of the names have any Indians involved in it at all. Were there no Indians, or they were deliberately avoiding that?
No, it's not that. The first Indian to be initiated into Freemasonry happened soon after the Anglo-Mysore War, in which British forces defeated Tipu Sultan. And the army of the Nawab of Arcot at that time, a person called Umdat al-Umra, had sided with the British against Tipu's army. And when the Battle of Srirangapatnam was over and they were victorious, this gentleman, Amdatullah, expressed a desire to become a Freemason. And he was made a Freemason. He was the first Indian ever to be made a Freemason. So it was going back, fairly early in our colonial history. And then, of course, Freemasonry gained traction in the 1850s onwards, because there's a huge gap in between. But the first large-scale entry of Indians into Freemasonry was in Bombay with mostly the Parsis. They were the first few to come in. Then, of course, others got in other things. So there were Freemasons there were Indians in Freemasonry at that time. Well, the highest echelon.
What about
still
2030, I see somewhere between 20 and 30, which is 24, like she is today.
I beg your pardon? I'm getting
2030, I see Prabha at 24.
Hello, can I say?
I think there's interference.
Can I say something, Captain Ramchandra?
Yeah. Who is it?
Biswakumar here.
Yeah,
Another
Bishop,
Freemason.
go ahead,
Another
please.
Freemason. Perhaps Bharat would like to tell you about the McMahon's role in the eastern border of our country.
Grave strands maybe, but otherwise I don't think.
The McMahon line is the one which is now dividing China with on the
Now at
eastern border.
2030, I wish you
One at a
all.
time, please.
Northeastern border.
Yeah.
Same McMahon. He was responsible for that. So it's probably a coincidence, but most of the borders were by Freemasons who have left a lasting legacy of conflict in each of the borders. So I don't know whether that's good or bad, but yes, McMahon also was responsible for the McMahon line, and just as Durand was for the Durand line.
Are there any
I
more?
missed out something else. Some other.
Yes, I was asking the question
Please,
regarding
sir.
people from the Islamic faith. Are there any more other than the Afghan Amir in the Freemasons?
Yes,
At that time?
the very first Grand Master.
No, I'm talking about at that time.
Definitely there were. Yes, there were, sir. There were. If you see the history of take the history of the state of Hyderabad, and the Hyderabad state, the Salar Jung was a Freemason. So were many people in the court. In fact, they had their own lodge. It was the only lodge in the entire world permitted to do their ceremonies in Urdu. Freemasonry spread all over British India. Wherever there were major cities, there were Freemasonry. Wherever there were cantonments, there were Freemasons. Wherever there were railway junctions, there were Freemasons. Wherever there were places like these, tea gardens, estates, there were Freemasons. Because these are typically the places where foreigners used to function, work from. So the Freemasonic lodges followed that pattern. And there was a large population of Parsis, there was a large population of Muslims. Hindus came last. The Hindus came in last among the major groups from India.
Was Lord Radcliffe also a Freemason?
Cyril Radcliffe, yes, sir, he was.
Pardon?
He was indeed.
He was also a Freemason, is it?
Yeah, he was also a Freemason.
I think Captain Dr. Balram wanted to ask some question. You raised hand. Would you? Yeah, please. I'll unmute yourself. Yeah, please.
I've already asked that question. I wanted Bharat to say something about the McMahon line in the eastern border of our country. He has already answered the question. Bharat is one of our very revered leaders who has headed the eastern region of our country in Freemasonic world.
Oh, I see. That's great. Brigadier Subramaniam, sir, you raising hand, please. Sir.
He's answered it.
Brian is, by the way, Satish, Brian is trying to get it.
Who is speaking, please? I didn't hear you, please. Somebody is speaking. But
Some lady voice is coming up.
your voice is coming up, but we cannot, it's not identified. Any more questions, gentlemen, please?
Very interesting and more.
Excellent talk.
Absolutely fascinating.
Thank you, sir.
So,
Thank you so much.
okay, if there are no more questions, we'll go to conclude with the playing of the national anthem. Please stand by when I. Good, okay, Dinesh.
Yes, sir.
Okay, no hitches. Dinesh?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, it's playing okay, isn't it?
Yes, it was great.
Yeah. That last time we had a hiccup in.
Thank you very
Great.
much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thank
so
you.
much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you
Good
once
night.
again. Thank you once again, Bharat, and thank you everybody who attended. And we look forward to, not only his talk, or we keep conducting, we bring in eminent speakers. So please attend. We'll try to connect with us. If you have a
Thank you and good night.
email ID or unknown, we'll send you the invites. Please send it. Right.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Right, good night.
Good night.
Good night, everybody. We'll see you next event. We will be notified shortly. We have it every fortnight. Next will be 10th of July. Good night, everybody.